There's a version of you that never got to exist. Maybe it was a career you didn't pursue. Not because you didn't want it, but because the family needed income and you were the one who was available. Maybe it was a place you loved and had to leave, because the political situation made staying impossible, because the economy collapsed, because the ground you had built your life on simply disappeared. Maybe it was the years you had planned to use, your 20s, your 30s, the period of your life when energy is highest and possibility feels most real. And those years were quietly consumed by a crisis that arrived without asking your permission. A pandemic, a war, a generation's worth of plans built on a floor that wasn't there. Or maybe it was quieter than that. A relationship that didn't happen because the timing was wrong. A path you turned away from at a fork in the road because the other direction was safer or expected or possible. And the true one wasn't. You made the reasonable choice. You did what had to be done. And somewhere behind you, something was left. Most people carry this loss in silence, not because they're unaware of it, but because they've learned over time that naming it doesn't seem to change anything. So they don't name it. They get busy. They build something with what they have. They tell themselves they've moved on, and they almost believe it. Here is what they don't tell you. The life you didn't live doesn't stay behind. It follows you. Carl Jung was the first to name this with clinical precision. He called it the unlived life, the version of existence that was compressed, bypassed, or taken from you, which doesn't dissolve with time, but accumulates in the unconscious, continuing to exert pressure on everything you do. And his most disturbing discovery wasn't that the unlived life exists. It was that it refuses to die quietly. But there's a distinction that most conversations about this subject miss entirely. And it matters. There is the life you didn't choose because you made a different choice. And then there is the life that was taken from you without your consent. The person who chose security over truth, at least, has a narrative of agency. I decided. The person whose youth was consumed by a crisis they didn't create, who couldn't stay in the country they loved, who couldn't study what they needed because the family needed something else first. That person carries an additional weight, the weight of real injustice, of a loss that was never theirs to make. This video is not about abandoning the life you have and starting over. It's about something harder than that, and more necessary. How to make genuine peace with the gap between the life you're living and the life that should have been possible, without collapsing into bitter resignation, and without a revolt so loud it drowns out everything else. What Jung discovered is that making peace with the life you didn't choose requires a specific psychological movement that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And the reason they avoid it isn't weakness. It's because doing it honestly means finally admitting how much was lost. It means grieving something that the world told you wasn't worth grieving. It means turning toward a pain that has been waiting, patiently, for exactly that moment. You've moved on. That's what you tell yourself, and most days you believe it. But then something happens. A former classmate mentions what they've been building for the last decade, and something in you tightens. Not quite envy, not quite admiration, something older and harder to name. Or you find yourself unusually bitter about someone else's good fortune in an area that, officially, you stopped caring about years ago. Or there's a recurring restlessness that appears in the evenings, in the quiet between one task and the next, a feeling that you are somehow always living slightly adjacent to your own life, present, functional, but never quite here. You explain it as stress, as personality, as the way things are. Jung had a different explanation. In his clinical work, he observed something that defied the common assumption that time heals what we leave behind. The unlived life doesn't dissolve. It accumulates. What you couldn't become, what was taken from you, what you compressed into something smaller so the practical life could continue, all of that persists in the unconscious, not as a memory, but as active pressure. Jung called this psychic energy libido in his technical language, and his insight was that energy invested in a self that never got to exist doesn't simply evaporate. It has nowhere to go. So it turns into irritability without a clear cause, into a chronic sense that something is missing, which it is, but you've stopped being able to name what, into a pattern of self-sabotage that appears precisely when real possibility opens up, as if some part of you refuses to fully inhabit a life that doesn't feel like the right one. In Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, Jung describes this accumulation as one of the defining features of the modern psychological crisis. The individual who has adapted successfully to external demands, who functions, who performs, and who nonetheless feels, at some level they can't quite locate, that the life being lived is not quite their own. This is not metaphor. It is a clinical description of something you may have been living for years. The mechanism is precise. When the self that was possible, the version of you that would have studied what you loved, stayed where you belonged, built what you'd imagined, gets compressed or cut off, the psychic energy attached to that self doesn't redirect automatically. It pools, and pooled energy under pressure doesn't stay still. It finds expression in symptoms, in the bitterness that appears without warning, in the disproportionate grief that surfaces when something small goes wrong, in the nagging sense of injustice that you can't fully justify to anyone, including yourself. What makes this harder is that most people interpret these symptoms as character flaws. The bitterness becomes evidence of ingratitude. The restlessness becomes proof of immaturity. The grief that won't fully resolve becomes a sign that you should be stronger by now. So instead of recognizing the symptom for what it is, a signal from the part of you that was never allowed to exist, you turn it inward and use it against yourself. The unlived life is not punishing you. It is trying to get your attention. The question isn't whether this pressure is real. By now, you know it is. The question is what it's been doing to the life you're actually living, and what it will keep doing if you continue treating it as something you've already handled. Because the cost of the unlived life isn't felt only in nostalgia. It's felt in the energy you lose every day to a grief that has never been named, a loss that has never been honored, a self that has never been properly mourned. And until it is, part of you remains divided, half living, half standing guard over something that was buried but never buried deep enough. That's where we need to go next. Into the specific weight carried by those who didn't just choose a different road, but had the road taken from them entirely. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. There is a version of this loss that comes with a story you can live with. You made a choice. You weighed the options. You picked one direction over another, and what was left behind was, at some level, yours to leave. That doesn't make the grief smaller, but it gives you something to hold, a narrative of agency, however partial. I decided. I was there. It was mine to choose. Now remove that. Remove the choice entirely. You didn't pick the country you were born into, or the decade, or the economic collapse that arrived when you were exactly the age where everything was supposed to begin. You didn't choose the family's financial situation that made your education a negotiation between what you needed and what could be afforded. You didn't choose the political situation that made staying impossible, the pandemic that consumed the years you had saved for something else, the crisis that rewrote the conditions of your life without consulting you. You were simply there, at the wrong moment, in the wrong context, and the life that should have been possible wasn't. This is a categorically different kind of loss, and it carries a weight that the language of personal responsibility was never designed to hold. Jung understood, in ways that most of his contemporaries didn't, that the individual psyche does not exist in isolation from collective history. In Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, he describes the modern individual as someone caught between the demands of external adaptation and the needs of an inner life that the collective rarely makes room for. A person shaped by forces far larger than personal choice, forces that determine the conditions within which any self can or cannot be expressed. The generation that had its formative years swallowed by a war it didn't start. The young person whose ambitions collided with an economy that had already decided who would have access to what. These are not failures of will. They are the result of circumstances that arrived from outside and rearranged everything from the inside. What makes this particular loss so difficult to grieve is that the culture offers almost no legitimate space for it. Grief over a choice you made can at least be rationalized, examined, even reframed. But grief over what was taken, over what the circumstances of your birth and your time and your context made impossible, tends to get met with something that sounds like wisdom, but functions like dismissal. Everyone has it hard. Others had less and built more. Gratitude is the answer. That response is not wisdom. It is a way of ensuring the grief never gets felt. Because here is what that kind of dismissal actually does. It takes a real injustice, the loss of years, of paths, of versions of yourself that deserve to exist, and converts it into a personal failing. The person who couldn't study what they loved because the family needed income doesn't just lose the education, they lose the right to mourn it. The person whose youth was consumed by a crisis they didn't create doesn't just lose those years. They lose the permission to say that those years mattered, that what disappeared in them was real, that the cost was significant, and the circumstances that produced it were genuinely wrong. Removing that permission doesn't make the grief disappear, it makes it chronic. And chronic, unacknowledged grief over real injustice becomes something else over time. A low-grade resentment that poisons the present without ever fully naming its source. A feeling of being owed something without knowing exactly what, or by whom. An exhaustion that doesn't respond to rest because it isn't physical. It's the exhaustion of carrying a loss that was never honored, a wrong that was never named, a self that was never given the chance to exist and was then told it shouldn't have mattered anyway. It mattered. That's where the next part begins, with what it actually means to let yourself know that. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. You know the loss is real. What you haven't done is let yourself feel it all the way through. There's a reason for that. Genuine grief, the kind that goes to the bottom of what was lost, feels dangerously close to collapse. So most people find a way to approximate it without completing it. They allow themselves a certain amount of sadness, a controlled acknowledgement that yes, things could have been different, and then they redirect. Back to function, back to what has to be done, back to the story that everything ultimately worked out fine. The grief gets managed, rationed, never finished. And underneath that management, the loss stays exactly where it was. Jung was precise about what unfinished grief does to the psyche. It doesn't resolve on its own. It doesn't become easier to carry simply because you've carried it for a long time. What happens instead is that the energy attached to the loss, all the longing, the anger, the unanswered question of what should have been, gets locked into a kind of permanent holding pattern. The person continues living, continues functioning, but a portion of their psychic energy remains perpetually tied to something that was never properly mourned. They are always, in some fraction, still standing at the fork in the road. What makes this harder is the specific way people avoid the grief. There are two patterns, and they look opposite but function identically. The first is resignation. This is the person who has decided, quietly and completely, that what was lost simply wasn't meant to be. They've made peace with it, or what looks like peace. They don't talk about it. They don't return to it. They've built something functional on top of the gap, and they've learned not to look down. This isn't acceptance, it's foreclosure. The loss was never mourned, it was just declared over. The second is revolt. This is the person who is still angry, who knows exactly what was taken, who took it, what it cost, but whose anger has never softened into grief. The rage is real, and the injustice was real, but rage without grief doesn't complete the mourning process. It keeps the wound open without cleaning it. The person stays in perpetual combat with a past that cannot be changed, using the anger as proof that they haven't surrendered, never noticing that the fight itself is what's keeping them from moving. Both patterns avoid the same thing: the moment of actual mourning, where you stop managing the loss and let yourself know, fully and without defense, how much it cost you. This is what Jung means when he insists that psychic contents that are not consciously integrated do not disappear. They accumulate pressure until they find another way out. The grief that isn't grieved becomes the bitterness that appears without warning. The anger that never softened becomes the exhaustion that doesn't respond to rest. The loss that was never honored becomes the invisible weight that makes the present feel perpetually insufficient, perpetually temporary, perpetually like a life you're living while waiting for the real one to begin. Genuine mourning asks something specific of you. It asks you to stop arguing with the fact of the loss and simply acknowledge its size. To say, this was real. What disappeared here mattered. The version of me that could have existed in different circumstances deserved to exist. The years that were taken were worth having. The injustice was real, and its cost was significant, and I am allowed to know that completely, without needing to immediately convert it into a lesson or a reason or a silver lining. That act of letting the loss be exactly as large as it actually is not weakness. It is the only move that creates any real possibility of presence afterward. Because the person who has genuinely mourned what was lost is no longer dividing their energy between living the current life and quietly resisting the fact that it isn't the one they would have chosen. They are, for perhaps the first time, actually here. That presence is where something else becomes possible. Not a return to what was lost, but a reckoning with who you became by surviving it. There is a comfort that this video will not offer you. It will not tell you that everything happens for a reason. It will not suggest that the path you were forced onto was secretly the right one, that the loss was a gift in disguise, that the self you were meant to become required exactly the circumstances that were handed to you. That is not psychology. That is sedation. And Jung, who spent his life refusing to sedate people, would not recognize it as wisdom. What he would offer is harder than comfort and more durable. In his framework of individuation, the lifelong process by which a person becomes, with increasing honesty and depth, who they actually are, Jung made an observation that cuts against both despair and false consolation. The self is not only what was possible in ideal circumstances, it is also what was shaped by the circumstances that weren't ideal. The person you are now, with the specific texture of your endurance, the particular quality of your perception, the precise places where you are tender and the places where you are unexpectedly strong, did not emerge despite what happened to you. It emerged through it. This is not the same as saying the loss was worth it. It isn't. Some things that were taken should not have been taken, and no amount of growth makes that untrue. But there is a distinction worth sitting with. The unlived life, the career, the place, the years, the version of yourself that circumstances made impossible, is real. Its absence is real. And the self that exists now, having moved through those circumstances, is also real. Both are true simultaneously. Jung's insistence on holding contradiction without resolving it prematurely is not a philosophical exercise. It is a clinical necessity. The person who collapses the tension, who decides that either the loss didn't matter or that who they became doesn't matter, pays a price in psychological honesty that eventually becomes a price in actual living. Look at what the years of constraint produced in you, not what you wish they had produced, not what a more convenient narrative would suggest, but what is actually there. There is likely a capacity for endurance that people who never faced your circumstances simply don't have. A literacy in difficulty that makes you available to others in ways that comfort and ease never could. A relationship to impermanence, to the knowledge that conditions change, that what seems permanent isn't, that life asks adaptation rather than guarantees. That is not cynicism, but realism, hard-won and genuinely useful. There is probably also damage, places where the pressure left marks that haven't fully healed, where the adaptation required something that shouldn't have had to be given. Both belong to the account. Neither cancels the other. Jung writes in Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, that the psyche is not a problem to be solved, but a living reality to be experienced, and that what we most resist examining in ourselves is often precisely what carries the most energy, the most potential for transformation. The unlived life, with everything it contains, the grief, the anger, the genuine injustice, the unmet longing, is not a wound to be closed. It is a part of the psyche that has been waiting for conscious attention. And what happens when it finally receives that attention is not that the loss disappears. It is that the energy locked inside it becomes available again. That energy is not abstract. It is the force that, once freed from the holding pattern of unfinished grief, can move into the life that actually exists. Not the life you would have chosen, not the life you deserved, the life you have, which, you are beginning to discover, contains more room than you thought. What that room looks like in practice, how you inhabit a life that wasn't chosen without betraying the self that still needs to be expressed, is exactly where we're going next. Making peace with the life you didn't choose is not the same as accepting a lesser version of yourself. That distinction matters, because the two can look identical from the outside, and from the inside, in the early stages, they can feel identical too. Both involve stopping the fight against what is. Both involve turning toward the present, rather than remaining hostage to what was lost. But resignation stops there. It closes. It decides that what was taken is simply gone, that the self that wanted more was naive, that the reasonable thing now is to want less. Peace, in Jung's sense, does something entirely different. It opens. The psychological movement Jung describes is not a retreat from the self. It is a return to it, through the only door that's actually available, which is the life you're already living. This requires a specific kind of honesty. Not the honesty that says I should be grateful for what I have. That is performance, and the psyche knows the difference. The honesty required here is the kind that asks, within the life I actually have right now, what is genuinely mine? Not what I settled for, not what I was assigned. What is, even here, even in these circumstances, an authentic expression of who I actually am? For some people, the answer is smaller than they expected. A single relationship that feels real. A creative practice that happens in the margins of the day. A quality of attention they bring to work that, while not the work they would have chosen, is still unmistakably theirs. These are not consolation prizes, they are footholds. And Jung's framework of individuation insists that the process of becoming who you are does not require ideal conditions. It requires honesty about what is actually present and the willingness to invest in it fully, rather than partially, rather than with one foot always pointed toward the exit, toward the life that should have been. The trap most people fall into here is what might be called the provisional life, the life lived as if it were temporary, as if the real one is still coming, still possible, still waiting at some future point when the circumstances finally align. The provisional life is recognizable by its quality of withholding. You don't fully invest in the relationships you have because they aren't the ones you imagined. You don't fully inhabit the work because it isn't the work you were meant to do. You don't allow yourself to love the place you're in because it isn't the place you were supposed to be. And so you live at a slight remove from everything. Functional, present enough, but never quite landed. Jung saw this pattern clearly in his clinical work and named its cost precisely. The energy spent maintaining that remove, keeping one part of yourself always slightly elsewhere, is energy that cannot go into the life you're actually living. It is psychic expenditure with no return. And over time, it doesn't preserve anything. It only guarantees that the life you have remains half inhabited, which makes it easier to resent, which makes it easier to stay removed from, which makes it easier to resent. A loop that tightens quietly over years. The way out is not a dramatic reinvention. It is a decision, made seriously and without fanfare, to stop withholding from the present. In practice, this looks like identifying one area of your current life, one relationship, one form of work, one creative or intellectual pursuit, where you have been investing at half capacity because it isn't what you originally wanted, and choosing to invest in it completely, not because it's the ideal, because it's real, and you are real, and the contact between two real things produces something that half contact never can. This is what Jung means when he speaks of the energy locked in the unlived life becoming available again. It doesn't return as a second chance at the past. It returns as the capacity to be fully present in what exists. Peace with the life you didn't choose isn't found by making your peace with loss. It's found by discovering that what remains, when you finally stop dividing yourself against it, is more than enough to live inside of. But before that discovery is complete, there is one more thing that needs to be said. The hardest thing. The one this entire video has been building toward. Everything this video has said has been preparation for this. You've heard the argument. The unlived life doesn't disappear. The grief that isn't grieved becomes chronic. The injustice was real and deserved to be named. Who you became by surviving it has weight. The present life, fully inhabited, contains more than the provisional version ever revealed. You've followed the logic. You may have even felt it. And now comes the part you've been half hoping wouldn't arrive. The reason most people never make genuine peace with the life they didn't choose has nothing to do with lacking the right framework. It has nothing to do with insufficient self-awareness, or the wrong circumstances, or not having watched the right video. The reason is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of that. To mourn the unlived life honestly, to let it be exactly as large as it actually was, you have to admit that it was real. That the person inside you who wanted that life, who deserved that life, who was compressed or redirected or had their years taken without consent, that person was not naive, was not asking for too much, was not wrong to want what they wanted. Most people never get there, not because they can't, because they won't. Because admitting that the unlived life was real means admitting that its loss was real. And admitting that the loss was real means sitting with a grief that has no resolution, no lesson that makes it smaller, no narrative that converts it into something useful. It means grieving something that the world has already moved on from, that nobody around you is marking, that you may have spent years telling yourself and others you were over. It means being, for a moment, honest about the full cost of a life shaped by circumstances you didn't choose. And that kind of honesty, in its early stages, feels indistinguishable from collapse. It isn't collapse. It is the ground becoming solid for the first time. Jung spent his career insisting on something that comfort-seeking psychology has always resisted. That the path through psychological suffering is not around it. That the unlived life, the shadow material, the contents of the psyche that have been avoided and compressed and denied. These do not yield to optimism or reframing or the passage of time. They yield only to honest encounter. And honest encounter requires that you stop protecting yourself from the full weight of what was lost, stop managing the grief into something more bearable, and simply let yourself know, without immediate consolation, that it mattered, that you mattered, that what was taken from you had value, and that the circumstances that took it were not fair, and that both of these things are true, even though nothing can be done about them now. That is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of presence. Because the person who has genuinely done this, who has stood at the edge of the unlived life and looked at it without flinching, who has let the grief be as large as it is, and the anger be as legitimate as it is, and the loss be as real as it is, that person discovers something unexpected on the other side. Not that the past changes, not that the gap closes, but that the present, for the first time, stops feeling like a consolation prize. It starts feeling like a life, specifically, unmistakably, irreducibly theirs. This is what Jung means by individuation. Not the achievement of an ideal self in ideal circumstances. The gradual, honest, sometimes painful process of becoming who you actually are, in the life you actually have, with the history you actually carry, inside the circumstances that were given rather than chosen. The self that emerges from that process is not the self that would have existed if everything had gone differently. It is something rarer, a self that knows exactly what it cost to become what it is, and has stopped apologizing for being built from those materials. You will not reach this by deciding to. You will reach it by doing the thing this video has been pointing toward from the beginning. Grieving honestly, sitting with injustice without converting it, recognizing what survived, and then, fully, without the one foot always pointed elsewhere, coming home to the life that is actually yours. That life is the only one available. It is also, when you finally stop resisting it, enough. If this video reached something in you, the one appearing on your screen right now will too. Click to keep watching.